Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And in a moment I'm going to play an excerpt from my latest lecture, Myth of the Month 26, The Industrial Revolution, Part 2, Spinning the National Yarn. And this lecture is brought to you by the province of Ontario. So this, obviously enough, follows on my previous lecture on the Industrial Revolution, Part 1, Conceiving a Catastrophe, which I posted a couple of weeks ago on all public podcast platforms for all to hear. The second one now follows up on that, and it's posted on Patreon for patrons only for 1 year. And you can hear this by signing up as a patron or by paying one flat fee to hear the entire playlist of Myths of the Month. And both of these options are linked to in the description. But I recorded these two lectures on the Industrial Revolution back to back in early May. And then I posted the first one, Part 1, on May 14th. And I saved this second, Part 2, for a bit later while I started working on other topics, including on French Canada. And I was going to keep it until the end of May, but I've had some internet problems here, so I'm posting a little earlier just to make sure that I get it uploaded in case these problems recur. But regardless, the first lecture explored where the idea of the Industrial Revolution came from, specifically how it came out of French political debates in the early 1800s, and then even more importantly, out of German radical philosophy, and in particular the work of Friedrich Engels, including his famous tract on the condition of the working class in England. But also as part of this narrative, I pointed out that the idea of the Industrial Revolution was still totally unknown in Britain itself in the 1700s and early 1800s. In other words, in the exact time and place where this revolutionary break supposedly happened. And this would seem to call into question the idea that there actually was an industrial revolution. So after I posted this first part, I got various responses across different platforms, including several comments defending the idea that an industrial revolution really did happen in this time in Britain. And they put forward various points. For instance, that even before the introduction of industrial machines like the steam engine, the regime of labor was already transformed from simple household production to big workshops and assembly lines. Also that people at this time were immiserated, living conditions got dirtier and more dangerous, especially because of coal, and that there was a dramatic population growth in Britain. So this is the demographic argument that society transformed from rural to urban. And one YouTube comment even said that I was just another American ignorant of British history because I supposedly didn't know this basic fact. But they later deleted that. And regardless of that, I felt compelled to respond to all of these different comments by saying, don't worry, all of this is already addressed in the next lecture, just hang on. So finally, this second lecture will discuss how the idea of the Industrial Revolution, after coming out of German radical circles, how it ended up finally making its way into Britain, where it was then adopted by various different political factions, including socialists and Christian reformists, and ultimately free market conservatives, and hence it was ultimately enshrined as a central shaping myth of British history. Then I discuss how the concept came to be questioned and scrutinized, leading to a debate over whether such an event really happened. And finally, we will consider the different counter-arguments, demographic, geographic, moralistic, that can be advanced to defend the idea of the Industrial Revolution, and we'll see whether or not they hold water. But now, without further ado, I will give a clip from roughly the middle of the lecture where I discuss how it came about that the Industrial Revolution was canonized as a central British national myth. And then finally, at the end, I will give a thank you message to my patrons in Ontario, Canada. Now, regardless of what we might say about Mr. Kaczynski, This debate carried on for several decades, from the 1950s through the 1990s and even to the turn of the millennium, between the optimists and the pessimists, between the revolution as tragedy and revolution as boon. But it's important to note that neither of these sides, the optimists and the pessimists, neither of these sides questioned that there was an industrial revolution. In other words, that there was a rapid, disruptive change centered in England in the 17 to 1800s that had profound world historical effects. And the question that they got worked up over was merely whether it was good or bad, not whether it had happened at all. And in fact, the debate between optimists and pessimists may have even led to a kind of inflation, with the two sides competing to establish themselves as the true authorities on the Industrial Revolution, and so turning out ever more extravagant statements about the momentous significance of this event. For example, Hobsbawm, whom we said was the foremost Marxist historian in Britain, he begins the introduction to his book Industry and Empire from 1968 with this line, quote, "The Industrial Revolution marks the most fundamental transformation of human life in the history of the world recorded in human documents," end quote. So that is about as grandiose as a claim can get, but also still maybe hedging here slightly with the caveat recorded in human documents, which, then excludes prehistory and specifically the Neolithic Revolution, in which, according to some anthropologists, civilization was launched. But other than that sort of implied caveat, Hobsbawm is making really the most grandiose statement that any historian could conceivably make for the importance of his topic. And then he goes on in discussing the Industrial Revolution. Hobsbawm goes on, quote, "For a brief period, it coincided with the history of a single country, Great Britain. An entire world economy was thus built on, or rather around, Britain, and this country therefore temporarily rose to a position of global influence and power unparalleled by any state of its relative size before or since, and unlikely to be paralleled by any state in the foreseeable future. There was a moment in the world's history when Britain can be described, if we are not too pedantic, as its only workshop, its only massive importer and exporter, its only carrier, its only imperialist, almost its only foreign investor, and for that reason its only naval power and the only one which had a genuine world policy," end quote. So it's significant here that Hobsbawm adheres to a basically catastrophic understanding of the Industrial Revolution, but the passage also shows how his book marries the profound significance of the Industrial Revolution with the central place of Britain in world history. And so the common shared belief of British economic scholars and historians at this time was that Britain leads the way. And for example, Sidney Pollard in 1981 published an essay called Peaceful Conquest, the Industrialization of Europe. And there he writes, quote, "The process started in Britain and the industrialization of Europe took place on the British model. It was, as far as the continent was concerned, purely and deliberately an imitative process," end quote. So hence, even if one adhered to a catastrophic view of the Industrial Revolution, like Hobsbawm did, nonetheless, this story could be very appealing to British patriotism, and right at a time when British national morale and cohesion were seen to be in crisis. So hence, it's not surprising that the myth of the Industrial Revolution would soon be taken up and mobilized for the purpose of patriotic revival. So what was the public perception and response to this debate about the nature of the Industrial Revolution? Well, the wider public gradually became aware of this intellectual debate. The awareness gradually trickled down through the 1960s and 70s into popular consciousness through books, magazines, university courses, textbooks, etc. And in Britain, starting in the 70s, perception shifted strongly towards the optimistic side, emphasizing the positive aspects of the Industrial Revolution. And this began, as we said, in the 70s, and it really accelerated after 1980. Now, why did this happen? Well, a basic condition of this era in Britain was that many heavy industries like textile manufacturing, shipbuilding, mining, and steel were shutting down. So now there were enormous tracts of property with large buildings and thousands of tons of machinery that are sitting idle. What to do with them? Well, naturally, make them into tourist attractions. So the heritage industry, which already, was managing castles and estate houses, this heritage industry stepped in to turn warehouses into museums, dockyards into parks, and machines into exhibits. By the mid-1980s, there were 464 industrial museums in Britain, and books and pamphlets were published mapping out heritage trails to follow to see the historic sites of British industry. Hundreds of preserved sites with visitor centers sprang up, many of them claiming to be the birthplace or the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, mimicking the way that the birthplace of some national hero like Lord Nelson or Mark Twain could be made into a local tourist trap. So all in all, the heritage industry trumpeted the patriotic myth of the Industrial Revolution as a heroic national achievement. And the historian Barry Trinder in 1976 wrote, quote, "The Industrial Revolution was Britain's greatest single contribution to world civilization. The monuments to its early stages are as unique to Britain as those of classical antiquity are to Greece, or the Renaissance to the cities of northern Italy." End quote. So this narrative was highly appealing to the British public and to elites. It implied that small, mostly depressed mill towns in places like Lancashire and West Yorkshire could be both as historically important and by implication as lucrative as the great museums of Rome and Florence. And this story served many purposes. It offered a possible solution to economic depression in the post-industrial zones of the country, and it bolstered national pride at a time of severe doubt. So this new thinking soon was taken up by scholars, such as, for instance, A.E. Musson, who in 1978... And finally, this lecture, as I said, is brought to you by the province of Ontario. I have always, from the very beginning of this podcast, I've had a strong Canadian contingent in Ontario, including Sam Mess, Christian Morasuti, Judith Rex, Aaron Donnelly, Adam Hustler, and Colin Gorey. Thank you.